So, Bitcraft. This is a classless sandbox survival crafting city building MMO being developed by Clockwork Labs. I've now played this game for 100 hours, and hopefully I can help you all decide if it's worth trying. Now, it first really popped up on my radar a few months ago when I heard about some of the testing phases, and I saw the simple graphical style that was kind of reminiscent of Albion Online. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this is the single most AFK experience I've enjoyed in quite some time. If you think RuneScape is a second monitor game, you could probably play Bitcraft while operating a fighter jet. With that being said, I actually just welcomed my second son into the world, and so as a dad with limited free time at the moment, this was somehow exactly what I was looking for. And don't get it twisted, I generally judge games, especially MMOs, that rely on an overly idle experience to drive their gameplay pretty harshly. However, given my current situation, it was pretty much perfect. So, Bitcraft, it's in its early access phase and it costs about $30 on Steam to join and participate. However, the full release is intended to be free to play. Also, it's important to note that any and all progress that's made in the early access is confirmed to be wiped at least once before the actual full release happens. Now, Bitcraft has been in this early access phase since June 20th, and since then I've seen a pretty mixed bag of reviews regarding the game. First of all, there were a ton of server issues on day one, which is to be expected and seem to have mostly been fixed. Also, the game is solely click to move. The developers have expressed that they want to test WASTA movement at a later date, but nothing is currently confirmed. And furthermore, some people think that the pacing, especially in regards to crafting, is far too slow. I can kind of see where everyone is coming from regarding all of these concerns. However, I have to say, after playing 100 hours, this game needs to be approached a little differently. With all that being said, it's always good to remain cautious, especially around early access titles with a $30 price tag. Anyway, let's jump into Bitcraft to find out what this survival sandbox MMO really brings to the table, and also where it falls short. So you log into the game and you're introduced to your character waking up from just laying on the ground. I spent the next few moments exploring the settings and I actually found a switch in the user interface where you can toggle a light or a dark theme, which is actually a fantastic addition. Next, a wisp spawns near you, and this acts as sort of your guide throughout Bitcraft, and he starts off by asking your name. Afterwards, you're told to open your vault in order to customize your character. Your vault is basically a control panel for your appearance, mounts, and different deployable objects that you get later on, as well as pets. Here you can customize your character's appearance by changing their hairstyle, eye color, skin color. You can also apply certain cosmetics, and I'm assuming later on, once they add an in-game store, this is how you'll access whatever is purchased through that system. When I was happy with my appearance, I again spoke with the Wisp, who rewarded me with 10 skewers of food. Food is super important in Bitcraft as it immensely speeds up your health and stamina regeneration. Stamina regen in particular is a constant variable that you'll always be paying attention to in the gameplay currently. One thing to be wary of is that Bitcraft, at least at this point in time, has very little content in regards to combat. There is a form of Slayer and a couple of different mobs to fight, but generally the entire gameplay loop revolves around crafting, city building, and progressing your character through the different tiers of crafting. If you're looking for a game with a lot of combat, Bitcraft, at least as of right now, is definitely not going to be your cup of tea. With that being said, the crafting, and we'll get into lots of that, is pretty awesome. And all of the different skills and variables work together in some fashion, which adds to a lot of depth, and it's actually kind of fun. Another important thing to note is that Bitcraft operates on a single server, in which everyone is playing on. Because of this, the map is positively massive, with different continents in which you can quite easily travel between. So if you and your friends hop on to play, don't be worried that you initially spawn very far away from each other near different starting towns, because in these towns you'll find something known as waystones, which allow you to fast travel pretty much anywhere across the world in order to begin playing together. This is definitely a game which benefits from group play, and I'll touch on that more later on, but my 100 hours was spent basically completely solo, with very minimal trading. Anyway, moving forward, the Wisp tells you to gather some sticks. Basically, 95% of the environment that you see out in the world is interactable in one way, shape, or form. And you can right-click to gather, given you have the right levels and applicable tools. From mining to fishing to foraging to hunting to just shoveling sand, there are tons of gathering resources that you'll constantly be hunting after. Every time you gather a new resource, you'll gain new recipes and information about said resource in something known as your compendium. This is probably my most used interface within Bitcraft, as it's very easy to use and search, and it tells you all pertinent information about what kind of upgrades you might be looking to make next. I took a look at the world map for the first time, and like I said, it's massive. As you can see, it's split up into these sections, and each of these indicate a different empire. Empires are player-controlled portions of land, and the smaller blue icons indicate settlements and player claims. These are essentially towns and areas that other players have made. You can either focus on making your own claim, or you can just join another players and gain access to all of their workstations and the bank and any other amenities they might have. This is part of what makes Bitcraft so unique. Instead of every player having their own sort of plot of land, which ends up being a very small section of a larger map, instead you have some players who do own these large settlements, which sort of act like guilds in a way that other players can contribute to. Since I'm starting Bitcraft a little late, it seems like tons of people have already laid claim to basically the entire map and take up large swaths and portions of it. Anyway, I finally decided to take a look around some of the other menus, including the Professions tab. Here you can see the 12 different professions along with any equipped items as well as its corresponding level. There's everything from carpentry and farming to smithing and tailoring. Furthermore, you have a Skills tab, and these act sort of differently from Professions. Skills can kind of interact with more general gameplay or every one of the 12 professions. For example, under skills, you'll find things like cooking and sailing, which are prerequisites which will help you and aid you in furthering your professions, but they aren't really distinct professions on their own. One good way to think about this is professions are sort of directly tied to your character's progression, whereas skills are more secondary. You could go through a lot of the game without interacting with skills, though you'll be massively disadvantaging yourself. Anyway, the Wisp prompted me north towards my first settlement, and really what I would end up considering my starting town. Along the way, I tried interacting with everything and anything I could find just to glean some more information. Immediately, I was already seeing things that were labeled as Tier 2, which would require level 20 to gather in whatever its corresponding gathering skill was. One thing I did notice while making my way towards this town was that on your world map, you could actually click a certain distance away, which will cause your character to auto-run to that location. It does seem to have a max distance, however, so you can't just auto-run wherever you want on the map and go AFK. But finally, on the horizon, I could see the town of Stonewake. Some other player ran by on some kind of goat mount, and although I didn't know it at the time, this is where I would be spending basically the next 20 hours of my life, absolutely grinding away. In the middle of Stonewake, I was able to click on this pillar and set the settlement as my home. This allows you to use a home teleport whenever you want to teleport back here, as long as you aren't carrying anything known as cargo. And now the game immediately begins introducing you to all of the different professions. First off, you're shown the workbench where you can make a flint tool bundle. This is the first tier of tools, tier 0, if you will. And this tool bundle makes all of the tools that you'll need for all of the different professions. One nice thing, considering that each of the 12 professions has its own tool, is that they're actually all equipable, so they won't be taking up 12 separate inventory slots. Next, I was told to gather from a bush, which I did, and this resulted in some plant roots in my cargo slot of my inventory. Your cargo slot can only hold one item at a time, and this actually results in a backpack appearing on your character's back, and you won't be able to run while you have any cargo. So I took said plant root to a foraging station where I was able to turn it into 100 rough plant fibers. As you can see, most actions right now are pretty quick to complete. Don't get your hopes up, it definitely doesn't stay this way at all. Now that I had these plant fibers, I was able to take them to a tailoring station to turn 100 of them into 2 rough spools of thread. The descriptor rough indicating tier 1. All of the tier 1 resources are known as rough. After that, I was told to turn these rough spools of thread into rough cloth strips by using the loom. Now, certain crafting locations, such as kilns or smelters or looms or farming plots, etc., operate a little bit differently. Instead of actively interacting with the crafting, you can just place them, usually upwards of 10 at a time, and they'll take a set amount of time to complete. For example, making these rough cloth strips would take 5 minutes to process, and during this time you can go do anything else. It's also important to note that this portion of the crafting process doesn't actually grant you any experience. So in the meantime, I was told to go chop an oak tree, which granted me more cargo, which I could then take to the forestry station and turn these into rough oak logs. Also, as you can see, the sun's coming up. Now, I'm not 100% sure if the day and night cycle really impacts gameplay. I think there might be slightly more mobs in the wild when it's dark out, and it also results in some decreased visibility, but honestly, in my 100 hours of playing, I really didn't notice or even care too much if it was day or night. I just went about my business. After my rough cloth strips finished processing, I was able to take them back to the tailoring table and turn them into rough rope. At a carpentry station, I was able to turn my rough logs into planks, and with my new rope and my new planks, I was able to craft the deed for a cart. You can then use that deed by right-clicking on it, which adds it to your vault and allows you to deploy a cart. Now, this is a total game changer because the cart can carry 10 cargo. And it also provides a bunch of further inventory space. Now, there are a couple of catches with the cart. You can't run while you're using it, and you might have issues navigating with it through certain areas that have differing verticality. But this really kicks your gathering and crafting into overdrive, and the cart can be upgraded later on and as you progress throughout Bitcraft. Next up, the Wisp leaves you with a quest that basically takes you through all the introductions of any of the other NPCs or notable locations that you can find within the settlement. First, you're told to go to a bank where you can store your items. This is not a universal storage, so if you go to a different bank at a different settlement, it will be empty. After that, you're shown the Waystone, and this is how you can teleport to different locations on the map. When you open up the Waystone interface, you'll see a bunch of different places that you can teleport to, which are unlocked by default, and you can use these to get to different continents or faraway places on the map. However, to unlock any more Waystones, you will have to actually travel to them by yourself and click on them to unlock them. All of this works with a system known as travel points, which you have to spend in order to teleport. Depending on how many items you're carrying, as well as how far away the location actually is that you're trying to teleport, this will cost more or less travel points. Apparently, travel points regenerate at a rate of 1.39 per hour, even when you're logged off. This allows for you to travel, and it allows for you to take goods to faraway places. However, it also puts a bit of a limit on it, to incentivize players to actually travel throughout the game physically. I think it's a pretty healthy balance. Now, next up, you're asked to talk to some of the NPCs located throughout the settlement. These NPCs, known as travelers, can be found at every settlement, and there's one traveler corresponding to every one of your 6 skills. From Slayer cooking and construction to sailing, merchanting, and taming. I was told to speak to Rampart, who is the Slayer traveler, and he teaches you about combat. There's a practice dummy in front of him in which you have to slash it a few times, and you can see there's a couple of different attack options in the bottom, each with their own cooldown. Like I mentioned, currently the combat in Bitcraft is very simple. It's basically click and wait with a couple of these additional abilities. And later on, I guess you can get certain types of weapons which will have special attacks tied to them that might grant a little bit more depth and strategy to combat, but honestly, in my 100 hours of playing through Bitcraft, I think I interacted with the combat system about 8 times. And only about 3 of those times were actually on purpose. It's currently, very much so, a crafting, building, survival game. Anyway, Rampart gave me a rusty short sword, and also this is your introduction to traveler tasks. Each of the 6 travelers in a settlement will have 3 tasks that are designated to things dealing with each skill. So, for example, Rampart basically has 3 Slayer tasks, all involving the same NPC, Jackals, because these are the only tier 1 hostile mobs in the area. Now, every 4 hours, these tasks will reset and you can do them again. And these grant hex coins, which is the currency used within the world, as well as experience in said skill. So Rampart's 3 tasks include killing a jackal, bringing back jackal fangs, as well as jackal fur. And in order to complete all 3 of these, I would have to kill 5 jackals in total. So I ran off into the distance in order to find a jackal. Surely it wouldn't be too difficult, especially with this new rusty short sword. I'd probably be able to make quick and easy work of a simple jackal. First, I found something known as a saggy bird. Couldn't come up with a better name. But by clicking on this saggy bird, my character actually began shooting a bow, which was interesting because at this point I didn't actually know that I had a bow. Apparently that was in my tool bundle that I had made prior. I thought this saggy bird was actually an enemy, however this is a hunting resource, and this is how you gather for the hunting and leatherworking professions. It actually took me about 5 minutes of running around to find my first jackal, which is interesting because during the rest of my time playing the game, these annoying bastards were always directly in front of me in any direction I was trying to go. And wow, I was absolutely outmatched. I did next to no damage to this damn thing while he demolished my entire health bar. Seriously. Luckily, it's pretty easy to run away and to get away from these jackals, so I just ran back home. It seems like I'm definitely going to need to upgrade my armor and potentially my weapons before actually starting on some of Rampart's tasks for the Slayer skill. So next up, I was told to speak to Heimlich to learn about the cooking skill. He had me go gather 5 mushrooms out in the wild and bring them back in order to get a recipe. Now, there are a ton of different plants in Bitcraft, many different types of flowers to mushrooms to bushes and berries, all of which can be used in many different skills to make foods, dyes, polish, you name it. It's interesting because at the start of the game, each of the professions seems quite linear and they don't seem to interact too much as you're just learning them. However, they quickly all start to become essential to one another. You'll find it fairly difficult, if not actually impossible, to continue progressing through the game if you're leaving one of your professions behind or lower leveled than the rest. This is a mistake I ended up making later on when I was beginning to progress towards tier 2. My masonry, scholar, and fishing levels were all still far lower leveled than the rest of my professions, and this actually barred me from making certain items that were required for my other professions. Anyway, I ended up finding those mushrooms, and an alpha jackal began chasing me, and I was able to get away from him, but when I wanted to teleport back to Stonewake, I actually ran into a bit of an issue. The game told me my position was out of sync and that the server was under heavy load, which could have caused this issue. I was sort of just placed into a random instance, and I couldn't move or control my character. Logging out and then back in fixed this issue, and honestly, besides this and one short stint later on which was immediately hotfixed, I actually had no server issues. Considering this was one of the main complaints on day one and during this early access release, I'm happy to report that it seems like the majority of the server issues, at least on my end, have mostly been resolved. So back into the game, I was able to cook those mushrooms, then I was told to gather 10 berries, and I cooked those as well. Cooking is pretty straightforward. You interact with the cooking station and you have a few different options. You can just cook the food, or you can experiment with it in order to have a random chance of learning new recipes. You basically want to be fed at all times while playing Bitcraft, as without food, your regeneration for both your health and stamina slows down drastically. Now, if you remember, I'm still in the process of going around and getting introduced to all of these travelers and the other stations in town. So next I met with Bricko, who is the construction traveler, and then I met Roomba, who's the merchanting traveler, and afterwards I met Svim, who deals with sailing. And finally, I met Alessi, who teaches you taming. Each of these travelers has those 3 tasks I mentioned, which reset every 4 hours, and this is how you train your skills. For me personally, I generally didn't really touch many of the skills because I was so focused on professions the majority of the time. But these skills are of course a major component of Bitcraft and will speed up your progression and allow you to do so much more. And that there pretty much marks the end of the tutorial of the game. You still have a sort of main quest and a few other side quests to follow along, but this isn't really a quest-oriented type of MMO. And this is when the grind truly kicks in. Now is when you better be ready to put in some serious hours AFKing, because trust me, this game is not for the faint of heart in regards to just how long it takes to actually progress. One thing I would like to point out is that I probably didn't play the game quite as it's intended. You see, there's a market within every settlement, and player trading makes up a massive component of the game. You can list items for sale on the market for hex coins, which you can then use to purchase other items. I basically spent my 100 hours as an Iron Man. I only used the market a handful of times as I wanted to interact with every skill and learn every part of the game. And while that's definitely a viable method to go about playing Bitcraft, you can also speed up certain processes exponentially if you're willing to spend the money as well as search out and buy things on the market. You could, for example, find some cheap resources that are already halfway refined or already gathered, which could skip certain steps in the training process. While Bitcraft can definitely be played completely solo, it's really about the communities you build and form and work together with along the way that will lead you to probably having the most fun and gaining the fastest progress. My goal at this point was to mostly just explore and to experiment with each of the professions. I learned about farming, where you have to make fertilizer by using berries or flowers or food, which you can then in turn use to plant seeds in order to grow other plants. These can then be used in a variety of other professions, from tailoring to scholar to leatherworking and more. I checked out the scholar table, and at the time I didn't really understand what I was looking at. It's probably the least self-explanatory of the professions in Bitcraft, but it's also pretty simple as well once you get into it. Next up, I took a look at the mining and smithing stations, and this prompted me to want to try and get some actual armor in order to face those jackals in the future. So I went out and I found a ferrolith vein. Ferrolith is the tier 1 ore in Bitcraft. I used my cart and completely filled up on ore, which you then take to the mining station to break it down into ferrolith ore pieces while gaining mining experience. And afterwards, I used the smithing station to break it down into ferrolith ore concentrate. Now, you might see this progress bar at the bottom. This requires 1100 effort, as it's called, in order to fill up. And as you can see to the right, I gain 8 effort every 1.6 seconds, meaning this entire task will take 3.6 minutes of AFK. And trust me, that is absolutely nothing. 3.6 minutes of AFK in Bitcraft time is like a single second. Anyway, once that was finished, I was able to turn those ferrolith ore concentrates into molten ferrolith by combining them with a wooden log in the smelter. And this would take 5 minutes to complete one, and I could do these 10 at a time, though I needed more logs. Which I got, and then I returned to the smithing, where I was able to turn that molten ferrolith into a ferrolith ingot, and this granted me a ton of different recipes. There's an entire ferrolith armor set, tons of different ferrolith weapons, as well as the entire ferrolith tier of tools, which I could now craft. Now, some of these were pretty simple. It would take just 2 ingots to make the boots or the bracers, but other recipes required other items from other skills. For example, the ferrolith plate body would require me to make rough cloth through tailoring, where I would first have to gather mistweave, and in order to make rough cloth, I would need wispweave filament, which is a piece of fiber that you can get through the farming profession. You can get the seeds for mistweave by using the foraging profession to forage bushes and get something known as the wild fiber plant seeds, and so as you can tell, everything slowly becomes connected. All in all, and this took quite some time, I want to say upwards of an hour or two, I was finally level 10 smithing, which actually unlocked my first title through the achievement system, Beginner Smither. And a little while later, I finally had my full set of ferrolith armor, as well as a ferrolith short sword. Unfortunately, I still had to make the 12 separate ferrolith tools as well. While making the ferrolith tools, you also needed rough leather, as well as rough rope. Now, in order to gather leather, you have to hunt animals through hunting, and then you take them to a leather working station to get their pelts, which you combine with tannin, which can be acquired through forestry by using tree bark and buckets of water, which of course you have to make using carpentry, and then fill the buckets using a well. And after you combine the tannin with the pelts and wait 10 minutes, you can then turn those pelts into rough leather and use those with the smithing skill in order to make ferrolith tools. So, like I said, everything is connected. Now, I wanted to take a break from all of this smithing and hunting and foraging and farming and tailoring and leatherworking, so I remembered the reason I even started smithing in the first place. And that's because I wanted to kill a jackal in order to complete one of those slayer tasks. And since I had my new armor and new weapon, I decided to try my hand once again at those jackals. And honestly, it was still a pretty close fight. They're not easy, and it's interesting because in the starting zones, you usually only have one jackal bothering you at a time. But further into the game, these guys can roam in packs of upwards of 5 or more, definitely posing a significant threat. Anyway, back at Rampart, I handed in the jackal fur to be rewarded with 100 hex coins, as well as 500 Slayer experience, which got me somewhat close to level 3. The next day, I was actually pretty stoked to hop back on. I'm not gonna lie, at first the game's grind felt like a bit of a chore. It's similar to the way grinding feels in old school RuneScape or some of the OG MMOs like EverQuest. You know there's this long path ahead of you, and it's going to be a fairly monotonous, repetitive task the entire time. But for some reason, our lizard animal brain releases dopamine upon completion of these tasks, and even just knowing you're working towards a larger goal can have the same effect. So I continued working towards a full set of ferrolith tools, and finally, once I reached about 10 hours played in total, I had the entire set of ferrolith armor, a weapon, as well as every ferrolith tool, and it felt pretty good. And these were my current levels in professions so far. I still hadn't really started on scholar, fishing, or masonry, as none of these professions played any part in creating the full tier 1 set. However, my highest skill was now smithing at level 17. The maximum level for every skill in Bitcraft is level 100, and even at the very end of my 100 hours, I think my highest level skill was in the mid to high 30s. So similar again to RuneScape, the experience ramps up exponentially and things start to take longer and longer as you progress forward. Now, despite the fact that I just finished close to 10 hours of smithing, one of my remaining quests was actually to work towards equipping a pyrelite tool. Pyrelite is the ore that makes up tier 2. I thought I had seen some pyrelite ore while out gathering before, so I went and checked it out, and it turns out you need 20 mining to even mine it, which makes sense. But at this point, I was a little bit lost about what I should work on next, so I decided to travel to the next closest settlement, which was just a little bit to the south, in order to unlock its fast travel waypoint, but also just to get a better understanding and lay of the land. Along the way, the environment seemed to change. It took on more of an orangish hue, and I started seeing all kinds of different resources. It seems like this orangish new area was more of a tier 2 focused zone. There were tier 2 mushrooms and plants and trees and ore and fishing spots. All of it was tier 2, though there were some higher tier resources as well as tier 1 located sparsely throughout as well. I had to swim across a small river, but eventually I made it to the second settlement known as Saltspire. Now, in the center of every town or settlement, there's a recruitment board where you can actually sign up and join said settlement. Once you join, you gain access to things within the settlement and also work towards its production. I'm still slightly confused about this system, as I'm pretty sure you gain access to the entire claim's full range of workstations, but I think by joining a claim, you can access some of the private storages and containers where players can trade or give away items to help others. You can also obviously donate to help them further improve and develop the claim. But either way, this new town looked awesome. They had multiple workstations of every kind, so you can work on multiple projects at the same time. Not to mention the entire surrounding area had mostly tier 2 resources, so I was assuming that once I had most of my skills leveled, my natural progression would be to come here. So I set Saltspire as a future goal and a place to name my home once I had properly acquired tier 2 and level 20 in most of my professions. And I went back to my starting town and began working on just that. First, I made the full cloth armor set, which grants you faster crafting speeds. And after I made the full leather armor set, which gives you faster gathering speeds. Generally, you want to be wearing leather while gathering, and then when you go back to town, wear cloth while crafting. At this point, I checked out some of my lesser played professions. I gathered some of the scholar resources, which ultimately led me to needing an item known as fishing oil, which you get from obviously fishing. Now, scholar is actually a rather important profession. It allows you to research new recipes within the other professions, but it also has just a bunch of miscellaneous and useful items that you'll probably end up needing in different professions. At this point, I began to religiously use the compendium. This is probably my favorite part of the entire game. It's just an absolute masterclass of a user interface. It gives you any and all information that you might need regarding progression in terms of crafting or gathering. I finally decided to start shooting for level 20 in most of my skills in order to progress towards tier 2. I started off with mining, and because I had so much extra ore, I was putting those extra ores on the marketplace in order to try and get some hex coins. And at this point, with about 20 hours of gameplay behind me, I finally had level 20 mining, and I could mine some pyrite, the tier 2 ore. However, if you remember, my quest wanted me to actually make and equip a pyrite tool, which of course would mean I need tier 2 smithing, but because tools require rope, I would also need tier 2 leatherworking. And so the same gameplay loop sort of repeats just like before, every time you enter a new tier of equipment, except as you progress along, it takes more and more time to actually level up. Now, in the process of leveling everything up to tier 2, somewhere around 30 to 40 hours of gameplay, I actually had a quest which wanted me to visit an ancient temple. This was a few biomes and settlements to the west, and this really is the main questline of the game, involving these ancient temples. So I decided to gear up, assuming I would have to deal with some sort of combat, but after traveling a decent distance to said temple, I just walked inside, and your wisp shows up to interact with you a bit before telling you to check out the center of the temple. After clicking on the energy font, you're given a charged automata heart 1, which is an amulet that gives you plus 50 health and stamina, which is huge. So basically, as you progress throughout the game, you're going to take this amulet to further and further temples while also upgrading it with different resources from each tier, and this will grant more bonus health and more stamina later on. Back in town, a bunch of my items had sold on the market, and I now had 500 more hex coins, which was pretty awesome. I vowed to make sure to keep an eye on the market anytime I needed future resources, but this never really happened. You see, Bitcraft is all about progressing forward. There's very few times where certain skills are lagging behind others. For example, if I want to level my smithing, well, I also want to level my mining in order to keep these two skills compatible. So it would seem silly to purchase ore on the market because that would increase my smithing gains, but it would leave mining behind. So at least for me, it just seemed like my best method forward was to Iron Man basically everything. But eventually, after many hours of gameplay, I was comfortably setting up home base in the tier 2 location. I kept my fast travel at my starting town in case I ever needed to go back, and I think this was a good idea, as quite frequently you might find yourself needing tier 1 resources. At this point, I started gathering everything in tier 2. There was new types of animals to hunt, new ore to mine, new trees to cut, you name it. And actually, while talking to one of the traveler NPCs, I realized I was able to purchase a deed for a new cart. This was, once again, a complete game changer, as this new cart allowed me to hold up to 20 cargo slots, basically doubling the length and yield of my trips out gathering. On my 4th or 5th day of playing, I'm not 100% sure, it all kind of turned into a blur, but another player asked me if we could try the new assist method while crafting. Apparently today was update day, I had no idea, and they basically added a system where other players can assist you while crafting something in order to dramatically speed up the process. Apparently you can have like a massive amount of players all working on one project, which sounds pretty awesome. Unfortunately, due to this update, the game was lagging pretty massively for me, especially when I opened the world map and I thought, oh boy, here's those server issues that everyone was complaining about. However, they actually had a hotfix out within about 45 minutes that completely cleared up any of the lag or connection issues. So, to be honest, that was not a bad response time. Anyway, hours and hours of gameplay later, we're talking close to my 100-hour playthrough at this point. I had finally upgraded everything to tier 2. If you don't believe me just how AFK this game actually is, take a look at me using the fishing station to deconstruct my recently caught fish. This is an action that will take well over 20 minutes to complete, fully AFK. At this point, I had a full set of tier 2 pyrite tools and equipment, as well as tier 2 cloth and leather armor. The leather in particular I thought looked pretty awesome. The final thing I really wanted to work towards was reaching the next ancient temple for my main quest. In order to do so, I had to first create some refined tier 2 materials. And this eventually led to the second ancient temple appearing on my map. Very far to the south. This would be the furthest I had traveled so far, and honestly, it was not a short journey. I passed some pretty impressive settlements and claims along the way where people had a ridiculous amount of workstations, and eventually I entered this sort of jungle forested biome that completely changed the landscape. Here there was a ton more verticality, you're constantly climbing up or jumping down obstacles, and honestly a ton more danger. There was new hostile mobs that could attack from range that dealt a pretty significant amount of damage. Once again, I wore my full armor set to travel this far, just in case the ancient temple had some form of combat, but in hindsight, I should have worn my leather armor, as that allows for increased runtime, as well as increased stamina regen. Because yeah, once again, I entered the ancient temple and I made my way to the center, and that was that. I now had the upgraded amulet, which granted 60 health and stamina, instead of the mere 50 it was before. But that just about concludes my full 100 hours of gameplay within Bitcraft. If I'm being completely honest, I didn't expect to play this game for 100 hours. I thought surely I would hop in and play and gather my first thoughts and impressions and share that with you all. However, my lizard brain loves a good number go up grinding simulator, and thus I couldn't really put it down. Bitcraft is not a game that you actively play and watch on your main monitor. This is a game that you play while you're doing something else. For example, while working towards this 100 hours, I actually played almost 400 games of online chess. I also listened to about 30 hours of podcasts and caught up on some YouTube that I hadn't watched in a few years. So in my opinion, Bitcraft can't really be compared to your standard MMORPG experience. Rather, it needs to be thought of as more of an idle game, at least right now in its current early access phase. There's very minimal to no combat, and the general progression loop is just crafting and gathering, which is okay. I love crafting and gathering systems, and I found Bitcraft to be compelling. It was awesome reaching those thresholds or new tiers and new items that instantly made your character more powerful in a way, through being able to craft or make new things better and faster than before. Will I continue playing Bitcraft? Well, definitely not in its early access, because we know for certain that all progress will be wiped before this game is actually released. And in a game that requires such long grinds and so much time commitment, it's hard to put that sort of effort in knowing that it's all going to go away. Although it is interesting, the same could really be said about any MMO. These servers won't be around forever, and these items and gears and levels won't matter forever, so isn't it really about the experience? And in that regard, I definitely had a good time playing Bitcraft. A thoroughly enjoyable, albeit highly AFK and extremely grindy experience that left me feeling satisfied and accomplished as I finished my goals. In terms of what I'd like to see moving towards a full release, I think Bitcraft could highly benefit from adding a more in-depth and active main quest, where you could be interacting with a bit more of the world and the systems. And definitely 100% combat needs to be basically created, as right now there's really very little. I would love to see a full-on Slayer skill, and I would love to see how every other profession and skill could interact and benefit from combat in its own way. Right now, this is Albion level graphics with RuneScape style of gameplay that definitely needs time to be more fleshed out. As it's only early access, there's definitely potential, but would I encourage anyone to spend $30 to play this right now? Well, if the progress were to remain, then potentially. However, knowing that everything is going to be wiped, it's tough to say. Either way, I have high hopes for Bitcraft, the city building settlement empire sort of system that I unfortunately didn't get the chance to fully delve into is definitely a unique take on map control. I'm surprised it doesn't revolve around PvP like these kind of games normally tend to do. So I'm really interested to see what kind of updates happen as development takes place. Anyway, folks, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who made it to the end of the video. Don't forget a like, a comment, a sub. Those things help a bunch. And if you really enjoyed the video, consider becoming a channel member. But anyways, I will catch you all in the next one. Later.